Edward's final campaign and death. Despite his declining health, Edward remained determined to crush the rebellion. In 1307, he launched another campaign, but his body was failing him. On July 7, 1307, he died near Borough-by-Sands, just south of the Scottish border. His last wish was for his body to be carried into battle against the Scots, symbolizing his undying resolve to subjugate Scotland. However, his death marked a significant turning point. His son, Edward II, who inherited the throne, lacked his father's military acumen and determination, providing an opportunity for Bruce to advance his campaign. The legacy of the Scottish resistance. With Edward I's death, Bruce seized the opportunity to strengthen his position. Over the next several years, he led a series of successful campaigns, reclaiming territory and solidifying his reign. The turning point came in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn, where Bruce decisively defeated the English forces, securing his position as Scotland's legitimate king. Edward I's campaign in Scotland, though initially promising, ultimately failed to achieve complete subjugation. His reliance on military force and brutal suppression methods alienated the Scots rather than breaking their spirit. The continued resistance of Wallace and the strategic cunning of Bruce ensured that Scotland would not remain under English control indefinitely. Edward's enduring impact. Edward's legacy in Scotland was one of both conquest and failure. While he had temporarily imposed English rule, his heavy-handed tactics ultimately fueled greater Scottish nationalism. His inability to completely subjugate Scotland demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Scottish people. His policies, particularly his execution of Wallace and his treatment of Bruce's family, had unintended consequences, solidifying opposition rather than quelling it. Although Edward's death in 1307 marked the end of his direct involvement, the war for Scottish independence continued. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Scots, the shifting allegiances of key nobles, and the perseverance of leaders like Wallace and Bruce contributed to the prolonged struggle. In the end, Edward's legacy in Scotland was one of unfinished conquest, as his long war failed to bring about the absolute control he had sought. Instead, it laid the foundation for an enduring Scottish identity and ultimately, an independent Scotland. Death and burial of Edward I. The final campaign and failing health. By the beginning of 1307, Edward I was an aging and ailing ruler, yet he remained determined to continue his military campaigns against Scotland. Despite his declining health, he prepared to advance against the persistent resistance led by Robert the Bruce. Bruce had consolidated power, gathered an army, and achieved a critical victory at the Battle of Loudoun Hill in May 1307, where he defeated Aymer de Valence, one of Edward's key commanders. This defeat only hardened Edward's resolve to personally lead another campaign to crush Scottish resistance once and for all. Though he had already begun to show signs of serious illness, Edward summoned his strength and set out toward the Scottish border. However, the strain of the journey proved overwhelming. While traveling north, he succumbed to dysentery, a common affliction that had plagued medieval armies. His condition worsened rapidly, and by the time he reached Borough-by-Sands on July 6, 1307, he was gravely ill. The following morning, as his attendants attempted to lift him to help him eat, the formidable king who had waged decades of war died in their arms. His passing marked the end of an era of military conquest and monarchical authority unmatched in England's medieval history. Edward's deathbed wishes and succession. Various accounts emerged about Edward's final moments and his last wishes. One widely cited legend claims that he requested that his heart be taken to the Holy Land, leading an army on yet another crusade against the infidels. Another version suggests he wished for his bones to be carried north with English armies so he could still be present in spirit for future battles against the Scots. While these accounts are speculative, a more credible version is found in contemporary records. Edward, in his final hours, gathered his closest advisors and entrusted them with the care of his son and heir, Edward II. Edward I's primary concern in his last moments was the stability of his kingdom. He reportedly issued a final order ensuring that Piers Gaveston, a controversial noble he had exiled earlier that year, should not be allowed to return to England. Edward I feared that Gaveston's influence would undermine his son's rule. However, his son, Edward II, quickly disregarded this order upon his ascension, recalling Gaveston from exile almost immediately. This act of defiance foreshadowed the turbulent reign that would follow, characterized by favoritism, political strife, and eventual rebellion. The journey south and state funeral. Edward I's body was carefully transported south, passing through various religious sites where he was honored with prayers and ceremonies. His remains were placed in state at Waltham Abbey, a prestigious and sacred location. Despite his legendary status as a warrior king, records of his funeral remain sparse. The total expenditure for the ceremony amounted to approximately £473, a substantial sum for the period, but modest for a monarch of his stature. It remains unclear whether the restrained nature of the ceremony was due to financial limitations or a deliberate reflection of Edward's practical and militaristic personality. Edward was eventually interred at Westminster Abbey on October 27, 1307. His tomb was surprisingly unadorned, constructed from Purbeck marble and lacking the elaborate effigy typically seen on royal burials. Historians debate the reasoning behind this simplicity. Some suggest it was a reflection of his pragmatic character, while others speculate that England's drained resources, due to decades of war, played a role in the austere design. Tomb investigations and physical stature. Centuries later, in 1774, the Society of Antiquaries of London opened Edward's tomb for study. Inside, they discovered that his body had been remarkably well preserved after nearly 470 years. One of the most intriguing findings from the examination was confirmation of Edward's height. The king had been famously tall, earning him the moniker Longshanks. His skeletal remains confirmed that he stood around 6 feet 2 inches, an exceptional height for the medieval period. The inscription and hammer of the Scots. Edward's tomb bore a Latin inscription that read, Edwardus primus Scotrum malleus hic est, 1308. Pactum serva, translated as Here is Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, 1308. Keep the trough. This inscription symbolized his relentless pursuit of Scottish subjugation and his vow to avenge defiance, particularly from Robert the Bruce. However, the title Hammer of the Scots was not a contemporary designation. The epithet was likely added in the 16th century by John Feckenham, the last abbot of Westminster. Despite this, it became permanently associated with Edward I's legacy, portraying him as the unyielding force that sought to bring Scotland under English rule. Edward's death and its impact on Scotland. Edward I's death dramatically shifted the balance in the ongoing English-Scottish conflict. While his military campaigns had placed immense pressure on Scotland, he had failed to fully conquer the country. His son and successor, Edward II, lacked the strategic mind and leadership qualities of his father. Consequently, the war against Scotland entered a new phase that would ultimately favor Robert the Bruce. Freed from Edward I's unrelenting military campaigns, Bruce seized the opportunity to solidify his rule. He reorganized Scottish forces, reclaimed lands, and launched a series of successful campaigns that culminated in a defining moment, the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. The overwhelming Scottish victory ensured Bruce's status as the rightful ruler of Scotland and secured the country's independence for the foreseeable future. This major event underscored the ultimate failure of Edward I's long-term goal to subjugate Scotland under English rule. Edward's legacy: warrior, reformer, and conqueror. Edward I is remembered not only for his military conquests but also for his significant contributions to England's legal and administrative systems. His reign saw the introduction of key legal reforms that shaped English common law, many of which had lasting influences on governance and legal traditions. However, his campaigns in Wales and Scotland, as well as his participation in European conflicts, defined much of his legacy. His war efforts against Scotland remain one of the most discussed aspects of his rule. While his victories demonstrated his formidable strategic acumen, his brutal policies and harsh treatment of Scottish leaders only strengthened resistance rather than securing submission. The execution of William Wallace and the aggressive crackdowns against Robert the Bruce's supporters fueled the very defiance that Edward sought to eliminate. His death came at a time when his conquests remained incomplete, and his son's inability to maintain his military legacy only accelerated England's loss of control over Scotland. Conclusion: the end of a monarch, the continuation of conflict. Edward I's death in 1307 marked the end of an era of military dominance, but his ambitions lived on in the policies he had set in motion. Though his efforts to fully conquer Scotland failed, his legacy as a warrior king remains one of the most enduring in British history. His title as the Hammer of the Scots, whether contemporary or not, symbolizes the relentless nature of his campaigns, his determination to expand English power, and his belief in an unshakable monarchy. Ultimately, his passing allowed Scotland the breathing room it needed to fight for and secure its independence. Edward's death was not just the conclusion of a powerful reign, it was the turning point that allowed the Scots, under Bruce's leadership, to achieve a decisive victory against English rule. His tomb at Westminster Abbey remains a solemn tribute to a monarch whose influence on British history endures to this day. Legacy of Edward I. Early histories and perceptions. The first recorded histories of Edward I emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries. These accounts primarily relied on chronicles of the time rather than official records, offering general assessments of Edward's reign. Chroniclers frequently praised his accomplishments, depicting him as a powerful and authoritative ruler who strengthened the English crown. In the 17th century, legal scholar Sir Edward Coke described Edward as the English Justinian, likening him to the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, who was renowned for his legal reforms. This comparison underscored Edward's contributions to English law and governance. As historical analysis evolved, scholars began to scrutinize Edward's reign in relation to the changing role of Parliament and the monarchy, drawing parallels to the political struggles of their own time. 18th and 19th century evaluations. By the 18th century, historians increasingly viewed Edward I as a skilled yet ruthless monarch. He was portrayed as a leader shaped by the demands of his era, someone who acted decisively when necessary. William Stubbs, a highly influential Victorian historian, argued that Edward played a crucial role in shaping English governance, particularly in advancing legal institutions and parliamentary practices. According to Stubbs, Edward's leadership set the foundation for England's later constitutional monarchy. Stubbs' student, Thomas Tout, initially supported this perspective but later revised his opinion after extensive research into Edward's court and household. Tout came to believe that Edward was a pragmatic ruler who used Parliament strategically, employing it as a tool to curb the power of the nobility while bolstering his own authority. 20th and 21st century perspectives. Modern historians have continued to reassess Edward I's reign, recognizing it as a pivotal period in medieval England. While some scholars hail him as one of the greatest medieval kings, they often contrast the effectiveness of his early reign with the difficulties of his later years. G. Templeman, in his 1950 historiographical essay, asserted that Edward deserves a high place in the history of medieval England. Over the past century, 3 major academic biographies have shaped contemporary understanding of his reign. F. M. Powick's volumes from 1947 and 1953 became standard references, offering a largely positive assessment of Edward's reign. Powick praised his legal achievements and commitment to justice. In 1988, Michael Prestwich published a comprehensive biography, focusing on Edward's political career. While still portraying him favorably, Prestwich acknowledged the king's policy failures and their long-term consequences. In contrast, Mark Morris's 2008 biography provided a more critical portrayal, exploring Edward's character flaws and emphasizing his role in persecuting England's Jewish community. Morris's work highlighted the darker aspects of Edward's rule, including policies that modern scholars condemn as deeply discriminatory. Debates on Edward's kingship. Scholars have long debated Edward I's leadership, questioning whether his reign was characterized by collaboration or oppression. Michael Prestwich attempted to evaluate him by the standards of his time, acknowledging his strengths while critiquing his political insensitivity. Fred Kazel concurred, arguing that Edward lacked diplomatic subtlety and often relied on sheer force to achieve his objectives. Prestwich ultimately concluded that Edward was a formidable king, whose reign was both significant and deeply complex. G.W.S. Barrow took a different stance, arguing that Edward fell short of the moral standards of his time. He described Edward as a leader driven by personal ambition, frequently displaying a vindictive nature. John Gillingham further developed this perspective, labeling Edward as an effective bully, but recognizing his immense impact on Britain's political landscape. Andrew Spencer and Caroline Burt provided an alternative view in 2014, reassessing Edward's role in constitutional reform. They described him as a creative and determined ruler who acted with a strong sense of moral purpose. Colin Veitch, however, raised the question of whether Edward's subjects in Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and the Jewish community would have shared such a positive evaluation of his rule. Differing views in England and Scotland. English and Scottish historians offer vastly different interpretations of Edward I's legacy. G.W.S. Barrow accused Edward of exploiting Scotland's leaderless state to establish English supremacy, reducing Scotland to a vassal kingdom. He argued that Edward's repeated miscalculations of Scottish resistance fueled deep-seated animosities that lasted for centuries. Michael Brown, however, suggested that Scottish independence was not inevitable. Edward's military campaigns could have succeeded had he approached the situation differently. Welsh historians, meanwhile, view Edward's conquest of Wales as a devastating blow to Welsh culture and identity. Arthur Davies described Edward's methods as colonialist, likening them to apartheid-style governance that marginalized native Welsh society. John Davies echoed this sentiment, noting the hostility faced by Welsh people under English rule. While Edward made some efforts to incorporate the Welsh into his administration, historians argue that these measures were insufficient to repair the damage caused by his conquests. Irish historians also regard Edward I's reign as a turning point in their history. James Lydon argued that Edward's use of Irish resources to finance his wars weakened the lordship of Ireland, while his failure to maintain stability allowed Gaelic forces to regain strength. These conflicts would contribute to prolonged unrest in Ireland, further complicating English rule. Edward I's treatment of the Jewish community. Edward's actions toward England's Jewish population remain one of the most contentious aspects of his reign. Barry Dobson suggested that this aspect of Edward's rule has become increasingly relevant to modern audiences. In 1290, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering the forced removal of all Jews from England. Historians such as Colin Richmond and Robert Stacey describe this policy as state-sponsored anti-Semitism. While anti-Semitic sentiments had existed in England prior to Edward's reign, scholars argue that he was the first English monarch to implement an official policy of persecution against the Jewish community. Paul Hyams and Robert Moore have examined the role of the Church in shaping Edward's attitudes toward Jewish subjects, suggesting that religious leaders encouraged his actions rather than these policies stemming from widespread popular prejudice. Many scholars believe that Edward's financial motivations played a significant role in the expulsion, as Jewish moneylenders had been heavily taxed and exploited by the crown. With debts mounting and Parliament demanding further restrictions, Edward ultimately chose expulsion as a politically expedient solution. This decision solidified long-term English anti-Semitism, shaping attitudes for centuries to come. Edward's family and succession. Edward I had a large family, fathering at least 14 children, possibly 16, with his first wife, Eleanor of Castile. Of these, only 5 daughters and 1 son survived into adulthood. His only surviving male heir, Edward II, ascended the throne upon his father's death in 1307. Edward II's reign, however, proved to be tumultuous. His reliance on Piers Gaveston and subsequent political struggles led to widespread discontent, setting the stage for rebellion and his eventual deposition. Conclusion: a complex and divisive legacy. Edward I's legacy remains a topic of intense debate. While many historians acknowledge his contributions to English law, governance, and military expansion, his methods have been criticized as harsh and often repressive. His campaigns in Wales and Scotland left lasting scars, while his expulsion of the Jewish community solidified patterns of discrimination. Although admired for his strategic acumen and legislative achievements, his reign also exemplified the limitations of medieval kingship, where force and coercion often took precedence over diplomacy and compromise. Despite these contradictions, Edward I's impact on Britain and Ireland was profound. His policies shaped the trajectory of medieval England, strengthening the monarchy while fostering resistance among the nations he sought to control. Whether viewed as a visionary leader or a ruthless conqueror, Edward I's reign remains one of the most defining periods in English medieval history. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.